The Detroit Red Wings had an eventful and busy offseason, and they are prepared to make a run at a playoff spot in 2022-2023. Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings is here to talk all things Red Wings on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. Gil Martin, so glad to be with you, and thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Red Wings, Brian Fisher. And Brian, a very busy offseason in Detroit. Overall, if you could use one or two words to describe the offseason, what would it be?
A+.
Okay. Why? Why A+?
Well, Steve Yzerman decided that this was the offseason, given the market, that he was going to finally spend that cap space. And from the moment, it was the night before free agency actually opened, the report started coming out from, I believe it was Bob McKenzie, saying that the Red Wings were going to go out there and try and sign Andrew Kopp, who was arguably one of the best centers / wingers on the free agent market. And the Red Wings had a huge need for a winger, or a second line center. Like, they have no center depth. That was one of their biggest issues with that, along with the defensive depth. And so he went out there, and not only did he sign Andrew Kopp, who, by the way, is an Ann Arbor native, but he signed him to a long-term deal. He signed him to a 5-year contract immediately. And that is such a huge deal in terms of rebuild, because when you're rebuilding, you don't sign guys to long-term contracts. And he went out there and he signed a very good second line center or winger, if need be, to a long-term contract. And to me, that signaled that the rebuild in Steve Yzerman's eyes was approaching its conclusion. Do I think that they're going to make the Stanley Cup playoffs this year? Well, that remains to be seen, because the Atlantic Division is a powerhouse. But Steve Yzerman is taking a legitimate step forward towards competitiveness. He went out there and signed Ben Sherratt as well to a 4-year deal, and I have a little bit more mixed feelings on Ben Sherratt, but it's still the 4-year contract is another example of Steve Yzerman going, okay, we need to make this team better now. He's no longer trying to tank for number 1 overall pick, which is a little bit of a shame, because Connor Bedard's going to be the number 1 overall pick expected this season. But the Detroit Red Wings, I mean, they were aggressive in the offseason. They traded for Ville Husso. They went a little bit off the board, I think, taking Casper as early as they did. But, I mean, last time Steve Yzerman did that, it worked out with a Calder Trophy winner. So I was really impressed with the offseason, as I always am with the moves that Steve Yzerman does. It's just everything he does, every move he makes seems to make sense.
Steve Yzerman, one of the more highly regarded GMs around the NHL. You mentioned Ville Husso, a big acquisition, a big change in goal for this Red Wings team. What does he mean to this team, and what do you expect from him this season, his first in a Red Wings uniform?
I'm going to say it. I think that with him and Nedeljkovic, it's going to be one of the best 1-2 tandems in the NHL. I mean, Nedeljkovic did take a little bit of a step back last season with production, obviously, in Carolina. When they traded for Nedeljkovic from Carolina Hurricanes, the big argument was that the Carolina Hurricanes had him a little bit sheltered, because that's a phenomenal team. And that proved to be a little true. He came to a Red Wings team that had probably the worst defense in the NHL outside of Moritz Seider. I mean, Moritz Seider was playing with Danny DeKeyser and Jordan Osterley on the top pair, which just at this point in their careers aren't top pair players at all. So they had no defense in front of him. He still managed to post a .901 save percentage, which doesn't sound great, but given what he had in front of him, you know, what could you expect out of a goaltender? You bring Ville Husso in, and you hear a lot of the similar things. He came from a good St. Louis Blues system. People are saying he was sheltered, but this defensive core is going to be better in front of both these goaltenders this year. And because they're both young-ish goaltenders, I mean, goalies, tend to blossom later. I think Husso's 27, Nedeljkovic is 26. I mean, Husso had a great year this last year. He had a .919 save percentage with the St. Louis Blues and exactly 40 games played. So you put him and Nedeljkovic, you split the workload, which is going to be easier. So I think that they're going to push each other and they're going to perform well. And I think that's going to be a real good 1A, 1B tandem. And I think that that's going to go a long way to making this team a lot more competitive this year.
This past weekend, the Red Wings were involved in a rookie tournament. Anything that stood out in your mind as far as some of the prospects and rookies are concerned?
Well, invitee Riley Piercy scored 4 goals against the Columbus Blue Jackets prospects team, and he was playing top line minutes. And, he looked good. He looked really strong. This is a guy who's just fighting for, an AHL contract. He's just trying to get signed. He looked good. He was putting himself in the right spots. He won a net front battle against David Jiricek for a goal. So he definitely stood out in that game against Columbus. But, I mean, when you're talking about the big name prospects, Sebastian Cossa played 30 minutes. He was picked the goaltender taken 15th overall, is presumed to be the goaltender of the future for the Detroit Red Wings. He looked great in the 30 minutes he played against Columbus. He allowed 1 goal, rather. Jan Bednar, a 4th-round pick a couple years ago by the Red Wings, played 30 minutes in both those games, and he played really well. Simon Edvinsson admittedly looked like he was being a little bit casual on the ice, but I feel like for him, that was intentional. He's probably trying not to get himself hurt. And let's be honest, prospects tournament for a 1st-round pick, a 6th overall pick, probably doesn't mean a whole lot. Really, where his test is going to come is training camp and preseason, because he's going to be trying to make an NHL roster. But Cross Hannes, the 2nd-round pick from 2020, looked phenomenal. He played with the Winter Hawks, I believe, of the WHL this last season, and had, I believe, 80 points in 60-some games. He was absolutely phenomenal. He controlled the pace of play. I think he was the 2nd best player out there on the ice next to Kent Johnson of Columbus Blue Jackets. He was phenomenal. He could, when the puck got on his stick, the entire game slowed down. He opened up the ice, and his vision was great. 2 of Riley Piercy's goals came from just cross-ice passes by Cross Hannes. He looks like he's going to be a phenomenal player. I'm really excited to see what he can do during training camp and preseason.
As far as the defense is concerned, you mentioned, they're more fortified now than they were a year ago. Who do you anticipate being the top 4 on this defense this year?
I think your top pairing is definitely going to be Moritz Seider and Ben Sherratt. I don't think you pay Ben Sherratt 4 years, I think 4.625, something like that, a season just to put him on the second pair. You don't give that guy that kind of money to put him on the second pair. He's going to be right there with Moritz Seider. Whether or not I think he's capable of playing top pair minutes remains to be seen, but he can be out there for 25 minutes a night. He's physically capable of doing it, and it's going to be a huge upgrade of who Moritz Seider was playing with. And then second pairing, I think it's going to be Filip Hronek, and I hope Simon Edvinsson. I mean, Simon Edvinsson was a Rookie of the Year finalist last year in the SHL. He's graduating to North America either way, whether it be with Grand Rapids or the Detroit Red Wings. So if he goes out there and has an impressive training camp and preseason, there's not a single player on the Red Wings roster outside of Moritz Seider that I don't think he can't outcompete. I mean, Mark Pysyk is out with an Achilles injury. I think he can outperform Robert Hay. He can outperform Osterley. He can outperform Lindstrom. He can outperform Oli Mata. So I think that he could be there. But if it's not Simon Edvinsson, I would probably garner a guess of Oli Mata would be the second pair defenseman. He's a very capable second pair defenseman, defensive defenseman who would pair nicely with Filip Hronek, whose offensive style would complement each other.
All makes sense. Sounds to me like there's a lot of optimism coming out of Detroit right now.
Oh, yeah, man. Again, if it weren't for the fact, if they were playing the Pacific Division, I'd be like, this team could be a division competitor, at least wild card competitor. But this Atlantic Division is so tough, with the Ottawa Senators being so aggressive as well and getting DeBrincat and Claude Giroux. And then obviously you have the top 3 of Florida, Tampa Bay, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, unfortunately. It's going to be a really competitive division. Boston Bruins, can't forget them. So it's going to be tough. They took a huge step forward, but this division took a step forward as well. So I don't know if they'll make the playoffs, but they're going to be a hell of a lot more competitive than they were last year.
And a hell of a lot more fun to watch,
yes.
I'm sure. Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Well, we're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Locked On Red Wings. Just put that in the search bar. You can find me on Twitter at Brian Fisher, WWJ. The WWJ is the news station I work at, the radio news station. The Twitter account for the podcast is at Locked On, LO_Red Wings. And then my co-host, Scotty, at Bentley Scotty. So check us out on Twitter. We're always tweeting Red Wings stuff. Scotty's also doing Tigers. He's host of Locked On Tigers as well. But Detroit sports, for sure. So check us out on there if you want to hear our opinions on stuff.
All right, Brian, thank you so much for doing this. Always a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's early season games. BetOnline is also your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. And of course, NHL preseason is just about a week away. You can head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts.